Hey folks, welcome to the first official video in my Ethical Skeptical Fitness series. There's a lot of ground to cover on this topic. It could go on for years. But before we get to all that, I want to begin by talking about the Voldemort in the room: fat acceptance, fat shaming, and the causes of obesity. Now, this is probably the subject most directly tied to the intersection of social justice, skepticism, and fitness culture that I want to explore in this video series. And it's the one that most reactionary YouTube jerkatrons devote their time to. It's actually something of a cottage industry for a particular segment of YouTubers to bash the fat acceptance and body positivity movement. And to try and avoid looking like bullies by picking on individual fat people, and typically failing, this gang of intellectual giants instead focuses on criticizing the pseudoscience found in some fat acceptance circles, then moves on to lecture the interwebs about thermodynamics or something, and closes, typically, by haranguing fat people that facts don't care about their feelings and to stop being lazy and start working out and practicing portion control. And since a lot of their comments are abusive and potentially triggering, I won't repeat them here, or play recordings of their words, but if you're feeling particularly masochistic, you can just go do a YouTube search for fat acceptance and see some of their work for yourself. Their videos are, unfortunately, some of the top search results on that topic. Now, it's not that these jerkatrons are wrong, factually speaking, about the mechanistic cause of obesity or the physics of weight loss. Calories in, calories out is basic thermodynamics and fairly easy to understand. If you create and sustain a calorie deficit by any method, healthy or unhealthy, you will lose weight. That is simple physics. The problem with these fat-shaming jerkatrons, and the thing that makes me label them as fat-shaming jerkatrons, is that they willfully ignore the context of the modern obesity epidemic. They conflate a simple physics problem with a complex social, ecological, and psychological phenomenon. Which is to say, they lay the blame for the dramatic increase in obesity rates over the last 50 years at the feet of individual obese and overweight people, rather than within a broader environmental and economic context. And their motive for doing this is pretty clear, based on the bullying and the mocking and the pontificating nature of their content. They just hate fat people, and they use so-called simple science and health concerns as a cover for behaving like the bullies that they are. And, big surprise, these so-called skeptics don't appear to have actually thought scientifically about the rise in obesity rates for even a few minutes, because if they had, they might have started wondering just what has changed about the world in the past 50 years or so that explains this dramatic increase. It can't really be as simple as upwards of 70% of the American public, including all feminists apparently, suddenly losing self-control. Particularly in the case of children who've never known any other way of life, among whom obesity is running rampant. And especially when we consider the fact that this obesity epidemic is also affecting non-human animals, including feral and non-domesticated animals. In a landmark meta-analysis published in 2010 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, an interdisciplinary team of biologists discovered that body weights and obesity risk among 24 separate populations of non-human mammalian animals had increased dramatically in the preceding 40 years. This included populations of feral rats in rural areas, that is, rats living autonomously from human control in non-urban environments. Among such rats, between 1948 and 1986, male specimens increased their body weight by 4.5%, and increased their odds of obesity by 19%. Female rats from the same population saw a 5.2% increase in body weight and a 26% increase in risk of obesity. And the effects were even more dramatic among animals living in close proximity to humans, including lab and zoo animals whose diets and behaviors are monitored over time, specifically to keep them physically healthy. Even among these animals, living on calorie-controlled diets and structured regimens of physical activity, body weights and obesity risk increased at even greater rates than they did for feral rats. Now, say what you will about humans, but do any of the fat-shaming bullies really think that non-human animals living in rural areas got significantly lazier since the 1940s? I don't think they do. No one does. All the evidence points to the cause of the obesity epidemic being environmental. Now, it should go without saying that obesity is multi-causal, especially when seen in an epidemiological context. But the potential for something like the obesity epidemic has always existed within human and indeed within animal biology. And underlying all the fat shaming and high school physics lecturing from the jerkatron community is their basic failure to see humans as animals, and to think about population-level behavioral and health trends among humans, such as the obesity crisis, as the responses of an animal population to external stimuli and selection pressures. When we start to look at the problem from an evolutionary perspective, the factors driving our global obesity epidemic become pretty clear, and they can't be summed up by simply arguing that obese people are significantly lazier than the rest of their species. Something else is going on. Overweight and obese people, for the most part, did not get that way by making poor life choices. They made natural, normal choices that billions of humans just like them made for the entire span of our evolutionary history. And indeed that billions, probably trillions of animals have made across that same span. What's changed for both humans and animals is the context in which those choices get made. Traits that are adaptive in natural environments can become maladaptive in artificial ones. Fat storage is one of those traits. Over the course of Earth history, animal species have been exposed to a cycle of food scarcity and food abundance that selected for the ability to store body fat as a backup source of calories during extended periods of food shortage. This natural selection was reinforced by the threat of predation during foraging. Being able to store calories in the form of body fat meant that animals could spend less time foraging for food and thus exposing themselves to the risk of becoming food, and more time focusing on reproductive strategies. Hundreds of millions of years of natural selection have primed animals, including humans, to be fat-storing wonderamas. Changing that system, removing the threats of food scarcity and predators, without changing the adaptive traits it produced, thus becomes a recipe for an obesity crisis. Since there is no longer a regular cycle of food shortage, and more individuals are living in a state of constant food abundance, they will predictably keep overeating in response to that food abundance, as animals have done for eons, as nature has selected them to do. And since the threat of predators weeding out the individuals who've gotten too fat and slow has been dramatically reduced, in the case of humans almost completely eliminated, there is thus no natural check on the upper limit of body weight and obesity risk for these animal populations. But even that gets us only so far. To get the meteoric rise in obesity that we've seen across the world, and across species over the last 50 years, we have to identify a causal agent, something that is accelerating all the modern trends that converge to produce the obesity epidemic. A mechanism that explains why all of these causes are converging on each other and causing a cross-species obesity epidemic at this particular time in Earth history. And that mechanism is capitalism. Here is one of the most fascinating scientific papers I have ever read. Not only because it references both the science on leptin hormone receptors and data on the Indian economy before and after British colonialism, but actually links those two things together in a comprehensive model that parsimoniously explains why so much of the world is getting fatter so quickly. The author's thesis is that increased rates of obesity are an inevitable, though unintended, consequence of capitalism. That's because capitalism is a system that radically changes a population's relationship to food and nature, and also radically restructures the physical environment in which that population lives. The net result is a new ecology that provokes the adaptive response of body fat storage, but does so within a context where that trait is no longer helpful. It has become maladaptive. And before you unleash a comment section tsunami about neo-Marxist SJWs infecting academia, take a few minutes to consider a few things about this paper. First, check out its author, Jonathan C.K. Wells. He is an expert on fat metabolism, and when this paper was published, he was working at the Childhood Nutrition Research Center at the Institute of Child Health of University College London. Not exactly a hotbed of Marxist agitation there. Then, consider where this paper was published. In the American Journal of Human Biology. Not some postmodernist or metamodernist humanities journal. This thing had to get past some pretty rigorous peer review. And finally, consider its tone. This isn't some ideological screed penned by an angry SJW. It's a serious and respected scientist with relevant expertise trying to make sense of a health crisis that defies effective treatment through the limited model of focusing on individuals and their lifestyle choices. This is a common theme in obesity research, actually. Interventions at the individual level have not made any significant progress in slowing, let alone reversing, the obesity trend. So researchers, especially those who study the problem at the population level, have been increasingly exasperated by the conventional wisdom that stopping obesity comes down to getting fat people to eat less and move more. They see the problem as systemic, and often comment in their papers that only a systemic approach will help solve the problem. So Wells, the author of this paper, isn't arguing from the fringes here. He is well within the scientific consensus that addressing the obesity epidemic will require fundamental changes at the level of public policy, not just individual responsibility. What sets his analysis apart is that he actually identifies and examines the system itself, rather than just noting that change has to be systemic and then shrugging it off agnostically. His argument is intricate, but it covers all the bases in a very elegant way. Wells begins with the recent research into epigenetics, which indicates that a person's physiological response to food is heavily influenced by environmental conditions they experienced in childhood and even in the womb. And further, that the environment experienced by their mother when she was a child or an embryo can influence their physiology as well. The effects are multi-generational, and once set, they are very hard to reverse. So, say your mother was born into poverty or some other environment that promotes undernutrition. The selective pressures of that environment can affect her gene expression in a way that triggers optimal body fat storage. And she passes that gene expression on to you, priming you to be an efficient body fat storer as well. This makes perfect evolutionary sense, and it is highly beneficial for populations living under boom and bust cycles of food availability, as most animals, including most humans, have lived for most of Earth history. The problem is that this adaptation can't be switched off when food remains perpetually abundant. So people in the West, and increasingly in developing societies too, have started being born into a system that promotes year-round food abundance, and they are getting fatter as a result. But capitalism adds even more layers. Primarily, it has changed the nature of food. Processed foods tend to be calorie-dense but low in fiber and water content, which makes them less filling. And they're infused with artificially high concentrations of fat, salt, and sugar, 3 flavors that evolution has primed us to crave, which makes these foods more irresistible and arguably even mildly habit-forming. On top of that, the structure of the market tends to make these foods cheaper than healthier, less processed foods, and so that makes them easier for people to acquire. So humans and animals who eat these foods regularly will find their mechanisms of satiation being fooled. It's not that they're lazier than previous generations. It is not that they are weak-willed or self-indulgent. It's that, given all of the above circumstances over which they had no control, huge numbers of them have to overeat just to feel full. Then there's the physical environment that capitalism has created. A world of vanishing wildlands and increasingly urban populations where most people have sedentary jobs. Where cities are designed to incentivize automobile sales and usage rather than, say, walking or bicycling. Where buildings make escalators and elevators easily visible and accessible, while often hiding stairwells or ramps behind closed doors. And right next to those elevators will be vending machines full of highly processed, fat, salt, and sugar-rich snacks available at the push of a button. Wells's paper makes the crucial insight and buttresses it with a mountain of credible evidence and reasoning that capitalism is not just an economic system. It is also an ecology, a brand new, never-before-seen ecology, and the explosion of obesity in both humans and non-humans across the world is an epigenetic response at the population level to the selection pressures of that capitalist ecology. And if I would fault the fat acceptance movement on anything, it would be that I sometimes see it as promoting capitulation to this system rather than resistance. I'd argue that fat people aren't oppressed because they are fat, but that they are fat because they are oppressed. But even that's unfair, because systems this big beat people down while remaining unseen and nebulous at the individual level. It's easy to get overwhelmed, and even easier to have never known any other environment. As has been said, fish don't know they're in water. So even framing the obesity epidemic as I do, as an unjust consequence of capitalism that the left should organize to resist, can come off as judgy. In fact, I'm sure I have come off that way before without even meaning it. Maybe even in this very video. And maybe it's a subtle distinction, but I think replacing a narrative of individual blame with a narrative of collective empowerment can be a valuable tool in building a movement to resist the obesogenic forces of capitalism. A lot of what I'm going to explore in future videos in this series is rooted in that conviction. There are ways to hack the system and empower ourselves and others to reclaim at least some control over our health and fitness. And there's an opportunity here for the left to build an alternative to the predatory diet and fitness industries who have monopolized the narrative. If we want to, exercise and good nutrition should never be framed as a requirement for personhood, only as a choice. But the fact that it's so hard for so many people who want to make that choice to actually be able to make it is deeply unjust. And those who don't want to make that choice, who don't care about exercise or physical fitness or good nutrition, well, they should not be written off. We all should have, we all deserve, a society and an ecology where the most sedentary person you can imagine is able to live their life with the lowest possible risk of obesity. We don't have that society or that ecology right now. Physical fitness and access to meaningful physical play and exercise for all bodies is a right. And I think fighting for that right will reap rewards we can't even imagine. If nothing else, it'll make us better at punching fascists. So until next time, remember to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in intellectual discourse with the women.